Welcome back to Law and Crime Live. I'm Stacey Delikat. On Monday, jury selection will begin in Atlanta in the murder trial against Claude Tex McIver. The 74-year-old is a prominent attorney in the area, and he is charged with the September 2016 murder of his wife, Diane. The couple was in the car on their way home. The car was being driven by a friend when Diane McIver was shot in the back. Tex McIver has always maintained that this was a tragic accident. I am joined now by Mr. McIver's defense team from Atlanta. On the line with me via Skype, I have Don Samuels, Amanda Clark Palmer, and Bruce Harvey. I want to thank you all so much for being with us today as we get ready for the trial to start.
Nice to see you.
I'll start with you, Mr. Harvey, because I know you were in court, well, you were all in court earlier this week, but I know you had expressed real concerns about jury selection. I know this is a case that is being very closely followed by a lot of people in the Atlanta area, and that because of the McIver's status, because Mr. McIver is also pretty politically connected, a lot of people know who he is and know about this case, right?
Calling from prison saying we're going to read her opinion or something.
Okay, I'm sorry, I missed that question. Could you repeat that?
No problem. Mr. Harvey, I was asking about your concerns about being able to seat a fair jury.
You're breaking up.
Okay,
I'm blaming this on Skype.
I know, Skype, so temperamental. I don't know if Mr. Samuels or Ms. Clark Palmer, you want to take this in terms of the concerns you all have about seating an impartial jury.
Yeah, we are concerned about an impartial jury. There's been an enormous amount of pretrial publicity. We expect more over the course of the next 72 hours prior to the time the jury selection begins on Monday. We are concerned about the way in which the press has described the facts of this case, some of which is incredibly inaccurate. We're concerned about jurors having preformed opinions based on inaccurate press coverage of what happened, about the circumstances, including history of their marriage. So we expect jury selection to be quite lengthy. The project takes over a week to find 12 impartial jurors. And then we have to eventually address the question of whether we're actually going to need a change of venue because of the inability to find 12 impartial jurors in Fulton County.
Do you anticipate requesting a change of venue, or is this something you're going to wait and see how jury selection goes?
We expect to make that decision during the course of jury selection. The rules in Georgia, in fact, the rules throughout the country are that if jury selection, if it appears that that a majority or a substantial number of jurors have preformed opinions, you kind of give up. You don't have to. You don't wait until you have 85% rate of unqualified jurors and say, well, we found 15%, so we'll go to trial with them. At some point, you just say, this is not the venue to try this case based on the inaccurate pretrial publicity that existed.
Your client, Mr. McIver, charged with malice murder, felony murder, 3 counts of influencing a witness, attempted bribery, and obstruction in this September 2016 death of his wife, Diane McIver. Can you give us a preview of your defense strategy? We know that Mr. McIver has maintained from the beginning that this was just a tragic accident.
Well, you said it. That is our defense. This is an accident. Everybody says that Mr. McIver and Mrs. McIver were deeply in love with each other. There was no trouble inside their marriage. Although the state has said that they think there's a financial motive for our client to kill his wife, that's just not true. Their finances were not in dire straits. In fact, he didn't stand to really benefit all that much from her death. Her estate and her will left bequests of money and things to other people other than him. So this was an accident. There was no intent on Mr. McIver's part to hurt or kill his wife. He would never do that. He loved her. Broken up about this and misses her.
Ms. Clark Palmer, you mentioned reports that there were some kind of financial difficulties. I know this is an area of the trial and of the defense strategy that you're focusing on, and I know that your defense team earlier this week asked a judge to not allow certain evidence into the case, and one piece of that was this argument that Diane McIver had a second will and Mr. McIver somehow concealed that. Is it true that she had a second will?
She did not have a second will. The state is not going to be able to present a single witness who can say that they saw this second will that was executed, or an attorney who says they prepared this second will. All they have are some emails from 5 years before her death, where she and Mr. McIver were talking about proposed changes to their will. They both wanted to leave money and property to their godson. So that's all they have. And there is no second will.
I know you would like a jury not to be told about this supposed presence of the second will, as well as a number of other pieces of evidence. And I'm wondering, I don't know, Mr. Samuels, if you want to answer this, whether you can tell us a little bit more about what the team argued in court this week about withholding some of that evidence.
Sure. I mean, with regard to the second will, understand that there is no second will, and what the prosecution is planning to do is to hypothesize that there was a second will, speculate that there's a second will. Nobody knows what the content of this second supposed will was going to be. There's no lawyer who drafted it, no lawyer who saw it. Nobody can say what the contents are, and it's ludicrous to allow the prosecution to get up and argue to the jury that, you know, hypothetically there might have been a second will, and therefore you should find Mr. McIver guilty. Because if there were a second will, no doubt he would have had a financial motive to kill his wife. That's ludicrous. The other types of circumstantial evidence they're relying on is the notion that once the gun accidentally went off and shot Ms. McIver, that he chose to go to Emory Hospital rather than Grady Hospital. They were right in the middle of Atlanta. And for your viewers, Emory Hospital is considered to be one of the finest hospitals in the country. It is rated as the third finest medical facility in the country, and that's the hospital he drove to. He got there in 7 minutes. And now the prosecution's saying, you shouldn't have gone to Emory. You should have gone to Grady Hospital, which has a better trauma center. And the theory is that he intentionally went to a hospital that was less qualified to treat a traumatic injury in order to ensure that she died. It is a preposterous argument the prosecution is making, to have chosen the third best hospital in the country as opposed to the public Grady Hospital, which happens to have a better trauma unit. And yet that's the kind of theory that the prosecution is throwing up here to prove that this was a malice murder, an intentional murder, that he chose a less qualified hospital in order to assure that she died.
Mr. Samuels, let me ask you, though, the fact that he says that this was just a tragic accident, a lot of people are asking, how does a gun just go off? How could this just be an accident that his gun goes off, she's shot in the back, and dies?
Well, the gun has a relatively hair trigger pull. He was asleep. He was asleep in the back of the car. That's agreed to by the state's star witnesses, that he was asleep in the back of the car. And the evidence is that, sorry about my phone going up there.
That's okay.
The evidence is that the gun was on his lap. It was sideways. It wasn't pointed upright like a gun normally is when it's shot. That even the state's experts agree the gun is sitting on his lap, sideways, you know, like this. I can't quite get it in the screen, as opposed to upright. And the you know, the notion is that this was an intentional killing. The gun is inside a grocery bag. The shot is not aimed at her heart or at her head. It's shot at the bottom of the car seat in which she was riding. All of the forensic evidence points to this being an accident. And that's why the state is relying on these, you know, these silly notions that maybe there's a second will. Maybe he chose the wrong hospital. Maybe his demeanor at the hospital was inappropriate. And that's why we think this is a murder case. I
know one other piece of evidence that the state had wanted to introduce was a statement that was initially made by Mr. Crane, who was acting as Mr. McIver's spokesperson, that Mr. McIver had the gun to begin with because he was worried about happening upon a Black Lives Matter protest. Is that the case? And can you talk a little bit about that?
When Mr. McIver and the driver, Ms. Carter, and his wife, Diane McIver, came off the interstate, they were in a part of Atlanta which has a lot of homeless people, the highest crime area in the city. and they were nervous that there was construction on the interstate which required them to get off the interstate. They had no choice but to get off the interstate at that point. They got off the interstate, and they were in this part of town that scared him. And so he asked to have the gun given to him. Both the women in the front seat agreed and gave him the gun. He put the gun on his lap. At that point, they started driving north. They started heading back towards the condominium where they lived, and he fell back asleep. Okay? Several days later, he was asked by a public relations guy, "Why did you pull the gun out?" And he explained that we got off the interstate, we were underneath the overpass, I was scared, it was part of town I'm not comfortable in, I thought there might have been carjackers, I thought there might have been homeless people, I thought we might have walked into or driven into the middle of a Black Lives Matter protest. He was just explaining why he was uncomfortable in that part of town. That got repeated, and that's an illustration of how the press has so blown this out of proportion into making this some kind of racial case. There's no race in this case. There's no racial issues in this case. But the public relations man that was working for the family or speaking for the family said that's what he told me. In fact, that was a weekend with a lot of Black Lives Matter protests, including in Atlanta. It was that late September of 2016. There had recently been a police shooting, and there were protests all over the country.
But he had fallen asleep in the car, though, as you said, right?
After they leave that part of town and they're driving north on Piedmont Road, which is a major artery in Atlanta, they're on a surface street. They're now driving north on Piedmont Road. He falls back asleep. He's 75 years old. They played golf that day. It was 92 degrees. So he falls back asleep once they're heading north out of that part of town. And the gun goes off when he is asleep.
As I believe your co-counsel, Mr. Harvey, who unfortunately his connection dropped out, as I believe he has said, this, we know this isn't a case of who done it, right? It's a case of why done it. And I'm wondering, the fact that Mr. McIver admits he shot his wife and he did it, does that make it just on its face make for a tough defense?
No, I don't think it does. It doesn't change the fact that this was an accidental shooting. He's never disputed that the gun went off and it was in his lap. He went and was interviewed by the police within days of Diane's passing and said exactly what happened.
One last question before I let you guys go. I know from media reports this trial is expected to last about a month, and prosecutors are expected to call some 100 witnesses. Can you give us a sense of who you'll call and whether Mr. McIver himself may take the stand?
Well, that decision hasn't been made. Any criminal defense lawyer would tell you the decision whether the defendant will testify is made at that part of the trial as opposed to before trial even begins. We've noticed a number of witnesses on our list, given notice to the prosecution, including some expert witnesses on the financial issues, expert witnesses on the forensic ballistic issues, as well as some other witnesses to talk about the circumstances and their relationship. A lot of the witnesses that the prosecution plans to call are witnesses who are very favorable to the defense. So we don't really describe them as being prosecution witnesses versus defense witnesses. They're simply witnesses, and many of them have testimony that we think will be very favorable to the defense. But we've added some more to our list. So we agree the trial is going to take between 3 and 4 weeks now.
Will, can you tell us anything about Mr. McIver's mindset, how he's feeling as this trial is finally getting ready to begin?
I think Mr. McIver is, on one hand, glad that the trial is here. He's been, living under this indictment and these charges for a while now. At the same time, he's nervous, as I think anyone would be if they were facing a murder charge that carries a mandatory life sentence. But I would say most of all, he is looking forward to telling the jury exactly what happened and letting them know and everyone else know how much he loved and cared for Diane and how much he misses her, and that this was an accident and not murder.
Okay, well, Don Samuels and Amanda Clark Palmer, defense attorneys for Claude Tex McIver, I want to thank you both so much for being with us via Skype from Atlanta this afternoon. Again, sorry we lost your co-counsel, Mr. Harvey, but again, the trial getting set to start Monday, and we do hope to talk to you again as the process goes on. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
All right, we are right now going to go back live to Brevard County Bond Court.